It's been 16 months that we have this war in Ukraine. As time went by, did you see anything good coming out of this war for Ukraine or even for NATO?
No, certainly not for Ukraine. And for NATO, it remains to be seen. NATO, of course, the NATO people, you see, they still think they're going to get back Crimea and so on, which I think is daydreaming. So, you see, it's very difficult to have a negotiation because the Ukrainians and even the West don't want to have anything but getting back all the territories that they had in 91, including Crimea. And that's absolutely impossible for the Russians. So, what can happen? I mean, they are stuck because the only negotiation would assume that there have been also Americans suggesting that maybe Ukraine should give up some territories and then be part of NATO, but the Russians don't want that either. And the Russians, the whole strategy of NATO was based on the idea that the offensive of the spring would be victorious and then Russia would be totally defeated and Putin overthrown and so on and so forth. But nothing of that has happened and Ukrainians have lost lots of people. The most sensible solution would be to make local referenda and see what people want, whether they want to be part of Russia or part of Ukraine or independent or something like that, or autonomous. I mean, that would be a very easy solution if people were rational, but nobody is rational because the Ukrainian insists that the whole country is theirs, even though it was created artificially in 1922 and then later during the war and then later in 1954 when Crimea was attached to Ukraine, So it's a tragic situation, but I don't see an end of it because the Ukrainians are still willing to fight. NATO is still willing to send weapons and money and so on. The Russians are not collapsing. So it's like World War I. You see, it can end only when one side collapses, as happened in World War I with Germany, or in World War II, for that matter. But I still think that Ukraine is in a weaker position than Russia. Because Russia is a big country, they have lots of people, they have lots of. Lukashenko just gave an interview to Ukrainian journalists and he says they have 250,000 volunteers now in reserve and they have weapons and so on. So eventually, I think the Russians will have their own offensive, maybe next spring or something like that. And then what will happen, you see? It's tragic. I think they should make concessions. And as I said, it's very easy to make concessions based on what people want. Maybe the Russian would accept that. But there is no sign. You see, it's imbalanced because in Ukraine, there is this very, very strong anti-Russian sentiment, which predates even 2014. It has been around for a long time, this very strong nationalist anti-Russian sentiment, so that they are willing to send people to die. And in the West, just money. You print money, we produce weapons, so it goes to the weapons industry. Your president is more reasonable, but there is no way that you can have negotiation when the positions are so distant from one another.
Because we know that Zelensky, he won the election on a promise of peace.
Yes, of course.
If it means that Ukrainians also wanted to be friend with Russians in those days, just to get along with Russians, if not friend, get along with Russians, and have good relations with Russians and with the West, but it's all gone.
Yeah, now it's done. Of course, the Russian so-called special military operation certainly did not increase it depends where. Of course, I think in the east of Ukraine, they do feel liberated by the Russian, but of course, how far does it go? I don't know. And of course, in the West, they are fanatically anti-Russian. But it's true. They should have made negotiations, just do the Minsk agreement. They should have implemented that. Sarkozy now is publishing his memoirs, and he's saying that more or less that he was holding the line that Ukraine and Georgia should not be part of NATO, and he was against, the run-up to the war. course, he did other things like the war in Libya. I'm not saying don't defend him wholeheartedly, but on the issue of Russia, he's the only French public figure who is allowed to say these things because he's a former president.
If we evaluate, if we assess this NATO strategy in Ukraine, it didn't work. But they're insisting on this counter. I don't know if you read this article in Wall Street Journal. They're talking about next spring counteroffensive. That it seems insane, and nobody understands that. If this counteroffensive, this year's counteroffensive, didn't go the way NATO wanted to be, why they're thinking about the next year counteroffensive?
Yeah, I mean, they speak of the next year counteroffensive, which is completely crazy. Look, as I say, it's just because on the one hand, you have people who are fairly fanatical in the idea of waging the war against Russia. And on the other hand, you have people who don't pay the price or not directly pay a price. They pay a price economically, but the elites don't care. And there's no protest. You see, that's also a remarkable thing compared to the Vietnam War or even the first or even the second Gulf War. But after the second Gulf War, when the Libya intervention occurred, when Syria intervention occurred, or even Afghanistan, there was no protest in the West. I mean, I'm not speaking, there are small groups who protest, but there are no large-scale protests from political parties, and there is no protest really from very few intellectuals or, politicians voice any criticism of the policy. It's really amazing. It's amazing. For me, this is really the decline of the West, that the West has no sense of self-criticism. The war looks far away for us, you see. I mean, not for me, because I follow that daily, but for many Europeans, they swallow the idea that Russia should be punished and Russia is going to lose and Russia is constantly losing and so on, which is not true. And it's sort of slowly people become conscious of the fact that Ukraine is not winning, but they are not, it doesn't have much repercussion. I mean, I think most people still think that the counteroffensive will win or something like that, or must win, or I don't know, or they don't care. People don't care because they see inflation, they see gas prices going up. They don't link it to the sanction, although it did start with the sanctions against Russia and the blow up of the pipeline and so on. I mean, it's sort of amazing how little, I would say, if I was a Marxist, I would say that the government should defend the interests of its national bourgeoisie, and even national could be the whole of Europe, but they don't care. In fact, there are many business people in Germany and in England so on are very unhappy with this. But they can't express themselves because the media is homogeneous. Where are they going to say that? It's very surprising situation, where everything is dictated by ideology, and there's no pragmatic consideration, no realistic consideration. It's very strange.
Do you think that the public opinion in Europe gonna prevail, gonna make some movement to change these politicians, or nothing inside?
But you see, the problem is always the same. I mean, if you have no party, no organization that gets people in the street or gets people to be organized, like the old left was doing, the old communists or even the socialists and so on, nothing happens because there is no spontaneous, I mean, there are spontaneous revolts, but then these spontaneous revolts are easily crushed like the yellow vest, and they have no, they have no coherent picture or anything, you see, and they have no, and since there is no opposition, really, there is no structure, except from the far right, but the far right, or the so-called far right, I don't think it's far right to be against the war, but that's, they are not very well, I mean, it's not in the tradition of the far right to demonstrate in the street, you see, at least not recently. And so they are not going to do anything about the situation. But it is remarkable that, in fact, it is the right and the far right who are protesting against the war, who are at least mildly criticizing the war. So I myself think we should just tell the Ukrainians that we're not going to, pay their armaments and everything forever, and they should sit down and negotiate with the Russians.
Because of the EU ban on Russian diesel imports, now they're shifting to the South America, to Brazil. Now they're, as Bloomberg reported, they're the largest supplier of oil products to the Latin America market is Russia right now. How do you see this in a long term for Europe? Was that a win? Is that a loss? They're losing? How do you see that?
But you see, it's almost, I would almost say that we are victim of our own racism. I mean, you see, when I read the Western press, I think I read the press during the war, because the World War II, because during World War II, the whole of Europe was either allied with Germany or occupied by Germany, except Switzerland and Sweden. So if you look at the press, I mean, I haven't read it, I wasn't there, but I've seen, excerpt on that. They were considering the Russians or the Soviet as a bunch of retarded Asians, and they had, of course, a very inefficient regime, communism, with a tyrant, a leader who was a tyrant, hated by everybody, namely Stalin. And they thought the whole thing would collapse. And in fact, Hitler said that to Mannerheim. Mannerheim was the leader or the general leading Finland and allied with Hitler. And he said that, I mean, he really thought that the whole house of cards would collapse once he attacked, and he didn't. And that's why also people were so surprised with Stalingrad, and after that in 1945, and he came to Moscow. And then that's why it was such a shock to people. And also I think in the colonies, they realized that the white man was not invincible, partly because the French had been defeated by the Germans, and the Germans were the superior race, were defeated by the Soviets, who were an inferior race. So this whole ideology where we are so superior and we can do whatever we want collapsed, and it was a big surprise. But now, when I read the press about the Russians, it's the same thing. I mean, their system is inefficient. Putin is a hated dictator, and holding. I mean, it's not said in biological terms. More said, oh, but they don't respect human rights. They don't have democracy, so the system can't work, etc. And it's not true. Their economy is doing fine. I mean, relative term, given the sanctions. Our economy is doing badly, given the sanctions. I mean, there's really nothing, that is. I mean, it's really racism. It's really this idea that we can't. First of all, we don't want to put ourselves in the shoes of the other people and try to understand their point of view of the rest of the world. Never. In fact, we don't understand Brazil. And there was a meeting between the, I don't know how you say it in English, CELAC, I mean the Latin American and Caribbean countries, and the Europeans. The Europeans say, oh, you have to condemn Russia, etc. And the Latin American countries say, no. Okay, that was good, but I think the Europeans don't even understand why they don't want to condemn. There have been so many coups, there have been so many interventions, there have been so many wars also where nothing has happened, and that the Americans say, well, we're not going to, sanction ourselves by sanctioning Russia when there is a war in Ukraine because you don't like it. So I think we are incapable of understanding that, and that's cultural racism. You see, it's not, of course, biological racism like Hitler and so on is not so fashionable nowadays, but cultural racism, we are so superior with our human rights, with our democracy and so on, is very, very strong. And we believe that because of that, we are more efficient, more superior militarily, economically, and so on. We are going to crush. I mean, Bruno Le Maire was the French Minister of Economy, said we're going to crush the Russian economy. And Biden says we're going to ruble into rubble. And nothing of that has happened. So they are, and I say we are victim, because we are not the only victim, we're not the prime victim, but we are victim of our racism. By racism, I mean this feeling of absolute superiority.
In your opinion, why the West couldn't crush the Russian economy?
Well, I was a bit surprised. I think Putin, of course, had realized after 2014, when there were sanctions because of Crimea, that he had to be ready for sanctions. Russia is a big country. It is actually sufficient. I mean, it is self-sufficient in many domains. And to my surprise, I mean, that was a surprise because you see, after all, there is a dogma in the countries of let's call it the global South, is respect for international law. And that's something which, of course, Brazil adheres to, everybody. And certainly the intervention of Russia, whatever they say, was against international law. So I thought they would be, in fact, they work on them in the UN, but very softly, without consequences. And I was surprised by the fact that, I mean, of course, you could say China has reason to be allied with Russia, but countries like India, Pakistan, now they have a coup in Pakistan, but Brazil, other countries, Latin America, I was surprised that they reacted as they did, basically. They said to the West, go fuck yourself, and we're not going to change our policy. We can vote at the UN, but that's it. I was surprised. I was surprised. So that's because Putin or maybe Lavrov anticipated that they don't suffer consequences. I mean, the West does not dominate the world economically. It's not so powerful. Doesn't produce everything. It has deindustrialized itself. The whole financial economy is a house of cards, in my opinion. So they need a lesson of modesty, like they got in 1945, actually, and they got with the colonial war also. But as I say, I grew up in this atmosphere, but in the 80s and the 90s, of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, then they decided now it's our turn to run the world forever. That never happened.
You know that Biden just recently said that we are running out of ammunition. That's why we are sending these cluster bombs to Ukraine.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's incredible how they're running out of ammunition with all these big budgets for the weapons companies.
I think that when I was in the States, I was talking to scientists who were in contact with the military, not me, and the problem is that those guys could surcharge for any item, a hammer could be sold for $400, something like that. But that was back in the 1980s. I mean, they could charge anything they want because, there is no oversight from the government and so on and so forth. And they are also privatized, so they don't have a real. The Russians still have a military-industrial complex in the sense that the state enterprise are producing for the military. And they're very well organized. I'm surprised because I've seen somewhere that at least nominally, the amount of money given to Ukraine is more than the annual Russian military budget. So it's not just that the American military budget is, I don't know, 10 times, I don't know how many times bigger than the Russian, but even the money given to Ukraine is formally, and again, formally because, you see, what does it mean? Okay, what does it mean if you, I don't know. I mean, yeah, and of course, sending these cluster munition, they use cluster munition in Laos. And when the Chinese build a railroad now between Laos and China, they had to, take away all these mines. So there are still mines in Laos, and the children are still killed. So this is going to hurt Ukraine for a long time in the future, unless the Russians are able to clear the mines. Maybe they are, I don't know. No, I live in a world which I find it very depressing because it's so absurd, you see.
Wall Street Journal reported that Egypt is resisting US calls to arm Ukraine. In your opinion, they really need weapons from Egypt to go to Ukraine, or that they're just making a political move in Africa?
You see, there is a museum now, the park in Moscow, which is full of NATO military equipment, which has been destroyed or captured and so on. So the Americans, also the arms industry, for example, is not so eager to give F-16, etc., to Ukraine because they are destroyed, they badly perform, which is likely to be the case. Then it's not going to be a good publicity for them to sell them somewhere else in the world. And the people will say, oh, maybe we buy Russian equipment instead. So I don't know. I really think they've put themselves in a quagmire.
RFK Jr. was talking with Tucker Carlson in an interview. He said that the US intelligence agents funded the 2014 Maidan protest to the tune of $5 billion.
Yeah, that's what they say themselves. They say it themselves. Victoria Nuland said that.
So what was the outcome of these investments by the intelligence?
But the investment was that they overthrew the elected government. They put a very anti-Russian. I think the whole maneuver, maybe since 91, in fact, but certainly since 2014, has been to try to provoke the Russians as much as possible, use Ukraine to provoke the Russians, like they did in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen. But of course, the difference being that in Afghanistan, there were no Russians. So the Russians were really seen as invaders. And that, of course, allowed the Taliban, or the ancestor of the Taliban, to gather the population, at least enough of the population, against the Russians. But in Ukraine, it's more complicated because at least in the east of Ukraine, there are Russians. The people are really Russians. They've been annexed there. And so the Russians are not, the Russians are not facing a guerrilla war from the people in East Ukraine or in Crimea. There's nothing there, okay? The war is only on the front. In Afghanistan, just different. There's a guerrilla war more or less everywhere, like the Americans had later. But
when we compare the Afghanistan war, the occupation of the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan to the war is going on in Ukraine, if you see the money the West spent, something like $130 billion, it's larger than, it's greater than the spending in Afghanistan during 20 years. I don't know how the West is going to continue this war in Ukraine. Are they sane, or what are they talking about? Because Europe is facing big problems. Car production in Europe reduced by 36% from 2022 to 2023. That's huge. That's a big part of Europe's economy. Are Europeans have some sort of leverage on the US policy in Ukraine?
Certainly not. But you see, as I said, some European capitalists are more and more angry with the US. And of course, there's always the business of the pipeline, which I think was blown up by the Americans, or at least with the help of the Americans, even if it was done by Ukrainians, as they say. And I think Seymour Hersh is probably well informed, and he says it was done by the Americans. And we don't want to have an inquiry about that. We don't want to talk about it, which really shows that we are a colony. In fact, the great irony of our time is that the whole world now, especially, is getting out of not only colonialism, but neocolonialism. And the only country which will end up being a colony is Europe, which invented this system and is now becoming a colony of the United States. And it's a colony like was the case with the colonies in the past, probably even Brazil, the Portuguese time, I don't know, namely that the elites of the country are fully collaborating with the colonizers. And that's of course, for the neo-colonial regime, that's exactly what happened throughout Africa, Asia, etc. So,
beside this problem in Ukraine, this conflict in Ukraine, we have another conflict in Taiwan between China and the West. And China was focused on economy. And I saw that the Macron's visit to China, he was talking about he's not willing to go along with the US plan, considering China. How do you see the EU's policy on China?
I don't know. I mean, they need China. So you see the problem, okay, whatever one thinks of the Chinese, the thing about the Chinese that for them, Taiwan is part of China, period. It was occupied between 1895 and 45 by Japan. And when Japan surrendered in 1945, Taiwan was returned to China with no ifs, no buts. And at that time, of course, there was the Kuomintang, and then there was the Civil War. And because of the end of the Civil War, the Kuomintang got refuge in Taiwan and made it semi-independent, but not formally independent. That was the thing that the Chinese always wanted to reunify. But it could be what they call one country, two system. I mean, one country would mean no foreign bases, no foreign intervention, no foreign weapons, etc. But two system in the sense that Taiwan could have a more democratic or formally democratic system. I'm sure the Chinese are willing to make many concessions and they have no desire to intervene militarily. But of course, the Americans are pushing, even though they say they don't, they're pushing for Taiwan to declare independence. And if they declare independence, then China will go to war. But that will be the case with in fact, that's what the Ukrainians do with the Donbass. You see, but the difference being that everybody there is Chinese, and it has been Chinese for centuries, and the Donbass has been artificially incorporated in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian government after 2014 was very anti-Russian. There is no anti-Taiwan sentiment in Russia, in China. Chinese say, no, we're all Chinese, we should get together, etc. So it's a very different situation. But you see, the problem, to me, the main point is that when there was the opening up policy of China, and the Americans accepted it and took advantage of it, okay? And the American companies make billions and billions of dollars by moving to China and exploiting Chinese labor at a low price, etc., instead of American labor, then those things would never have occurred if the Americans had not agreed that Taiwan, to the one China policy, Taiwan is part of China, etc., etc. They all signed it. It was signed in international law at the UN. All countries in the world, except maybe Paraguay and some other, recognize China as the one China, the real China, and have abandoned relation with Taiwan. I think one of the last one to do that was Honduras in Latin America. If I'm not mistaken, they abandoned that. And there's a handful of countries who still stick. I mean, when I was young, for example, Formosa, as it was called, namely Taiwan, was, of course, the real China for us. And it's the Gaulle who started changing the attitude, and then Nixon, etc. And then I don't know when Belgium changed, but they followed suit. But the point for me is that there has been an enormous advantage, at least for the American capitalists, to have this one China policy, because without that, they could never have invested in China. China always was adamant about that. Why are they adamant? That's a matter of national pride. It's a matter of century of humiliation, and so on and so forth. That's not my business, but that's a fact. So there's something really scandalous again in the attitude of the Americans after having accepted that, and after having, at least for their capitalist class, benefited from that, not the workers, but the capitalists. Then they say, no, maybe China, we want to prevent aggression of China into Taiwan, but there is no aggression. They always speak of peaceful reunification, but they want the reunification. If the reunification is impossible peacefully, okay, what does it mean? It means Taiwan would declare independence, because for the moment the situation is frozen, and China thinks because there are increased links and there are business doing business in China and in Taiwan and so on, and there are people studying in mainland China, and all kinds of exchange between Taiwan and mainland China, that eventually they will merge by the force of gravity, so to speak. You see, in the 19th century, for example, the Americans said that Cuba would finally fall under American control by the force of gravity, and of course that's what happened, but not just by the force of gravity. But and eventually Cuba didn't like that. But it seemed to me that it's very natural, and they are willing to make a compromise about the form of government in Taiwan. I don't understand how one could possibly go to war because of the form of autonomy that the province wants to have. Province which is recognized as a province. I mean, are we going to go to war with Spain because of Catalonia? I mean, the Spanish are pretty adamant that Catalonia is part of Spain and there is no referendum or anything like that. I'm not going to go to war with Spain over that. Huh? Are we going to go to war with India over Kashmir? Kashmir is a region of India which isn't happy about being part of India. They're in sort of permanent revolt. There are Indian armies over there. There are lots of situations like that. And certainly the agitation about Taiwan, and then of course they make it like that's the first step to dominate the world. The Chinese have no intention to dominate anybody. But Taiwan, for historical reason, is considered part of China, is inhabited by Chinese. They speak Chinese, they have Chinese culture and everything. They're going to invade Australia after having, or the Philippines after, if they reunify with Taiwan, okay?
How do you see the likelihood of having new war in Taiwan? Is that possible?
I don't think so. I mean, certainly Chinese are going, I mean, as I say, the Chinese will not start a war. I'm convinced of that, unless Taiwan declare independence. But what would be a war? Suppose they do it. What would be smart for the Chinese to do? They've already shown that they can do it. They will just encircle with their boat the island and prevent all ships going to Taiwan, like the Russians are doing in the Black Sea. And then what is Taiwan going to do? Taiwan is not self-sufficient in food or in energy. So after 2 weeks, they have to surrender, unless the American intervene and attack the Chinese Navy in the Taiwan, around Taiwan. But that's a big thing. You see, I don't know if the Americans would dare to do that. So it's very easy. I'm saying it's very easy for China to conquer its own province, Taiwan, without firing a shot, just by having this embargo, like they do with Cuba, but in a more radical way and in a way that that Taiwan cannot possibly escape.
Do you think that is there any political party inside Taiwan that's go along with the US agenda, like these neo-Nazis in Ukraine?
Oh yeah. There's the party in power now is pro-independence, but I don't know how openly they are. But what is interesting is that maybe they will win the next election, the Kuomintang, with the old party which created the problem by taking refuge in Taiwan and has been running Taiwan for a long time. They may win the election, and they are for one China. They have a one China policy. Of course, their theory has always been that they are the real government of China and China is illegitimate. But now, so Mao Zedong is dead, Chiang Kai-shek is dead, they're all dead. So the younger generation, although they cling to the one China policy, they don't want independence. They must be realistic enough to realize that they aren't going to run the whole of China, okay? So the logical outcome for them, if they're for one China policy, is to try to find the best possible deal to have enough of the actual institution in Taiwan to survive. I think if they want a parliament like they have and something like that, I don't see that the Chinese will oppose that. The Chinese don't feel threatened by democracy because their system works and the people seem to be happy with their system. Their system isn't that anti-democratic in the sense that there are elections at every level in China. We should not forget that it's not a multi-party democracy, but it's a democracy at the various levels. People are elected and they don't want to have a Trump or a Biden being elected. So the elections are stage by stage and they're controlled and people have to prove their worth before moving upward, you see. While in the US, you can be president without having ever done anything good like Trump or Biden. But if Taiwan wants to have its election and its system, I think they can keep. I'm not sure, but I think they will be able to keep that. The thing is extremely symbolic, you see. China does not want the continuation of the century of humiliation. And Taiwan independence, or the fact that Taiwan isn't run by China, is a consequence of that. I mean, there would be no Taiwan question, no Taiwan secession, nothing like that if Taiwan had not been taken by the Japanese in 1895, okay? I mean, okay, maybe the Kuomintang would have found refuge in Taiwan, I don't know, but it's all due to the past and they want to erase the past.
To overcome these problems in Ukraine and Taiwan, we need a new policy in Washington. And it seems that the Biden administration is not going to give up on any of these policies, these failed policies. And how do you see the future of these policymakers in Washington? Are we going to have a change in the US? In your opinion, are we going to have a Republican candidates? We have now Donald Trump. The other candidates in the Republican Party, we have RFK Jr. And how do you see that?
RFK Jr. is in the Democratic Party.
He's on the he's on the Democratic Party. I'm talking about Donald Trump and Ramaswamy. If I pronounce his...
DeSantis is totally aligned on the neoconservative policy. The one who is critical, but is a bit crazy for various things about science, is RFK Jr. But I think he's so strange and so demonized that I don't see how he could possibly win a primary. And they may even decide not to run a primary, not to allow him to run the primaries. I don't know. I was listening this morning to a broadcast. Somebody was suggesting that actually what the Democrats will do is substitute somebody for Biden at the convention, but not before. because they don't want to have primaries. For example, if they put, I forget his name now, the government of California as a
Newsom,
candidate.
Gavin
Yeah,
Newsom.
Gavin Newsom, yes. If they put him as a candidate, then he might be defeated by RFK Jr. in primary, so it's a delicate game. But I have the impression that they don't want to keep Biden. Also, if they keep Biden, what tells you that he won't have a more serious heart problem or, a health problem, and they have to replace him by Kamala Harris. But Kamala Harris is hated by everybody. She's an absolute disaster. She can't make a sentence, meaningful sentence. So she's a no-no. So they may want to get rid of the duo, Biden-Harris, which would be the natural duo if Biden runs. I think the Democrats are in a difficult situation. I find it extraordinary. It's a big country. It's very difficult for them to find a decent candidate on either side because Trump is a bit of a joke, to say the least, and Biden has every conceivable problem. We don't know if he's running anything, if he understands what he's doing. I mean, it's unbelievable. So, so I think they will try to replace Biden, but I don't know how they're going to do. If there is Trump versus Biden, I think Trump may win now, because Biden is very unpopular.
But
Because
if Biden wins the next election, do you think he's going to change his policy or he's going to go along with the same policy?
No, because he doesn't have a policy of its own. I think there's the State Department is running things, and some people like Blinken. I mean, no. It's all firmly in the hands of neoconservatives. So I don't have any hope of change. I don't even have much hope of change if Trump was elected, because Trump makes big sentences, but what is he going to do?
It's so sad to see that.
Yeah.
China is participating in construction in Africa. 34% of their infrastructures are getting constructed by China. We can see the power China has in Africa.
Yeah.
And we see this new military alliance with Russia, this Wagner group in Niger, and so forth and so on. How are we going to have a new confrontation between the West and Russia and China, West on one side and Russia and China on the other side in Africa?
Yes, that's what they are heading to, but it's absurd. They're not going to win. It's very difficult to, they can win in the short term like they won the Iraq war, but then in the long term, you should also realize that one of the main reasons why Wagner is there, and one of the main reasons why there have been coup and everything, is because of the Libyan war. They're still justifying the Libyan war, but the Libyan war unleashed the jihadists, okay, the radical Islamists. And those guys, of course, came then to the south in Niger, Burkina Faso, I'm not sure exactly which one, but in those states, and they destabilized those states. They are now actually in Niger, attacks from the jihadists against the Nigerian forces. Maybe they're used by the West, I don't know, they've been using them in Syria, so I don't know, but maybe they're using them, and it's of course, the people in Niger aren't happy about that because nobody, it's always the same thing. The West comes, boom, 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 boom. You destroy, you kill, Gaddafi is dead. We came, we saw he died. That's what Hillary Clinton said. We're very happy. And the consequences for the people of the region in terms of immigration, in terms of everything, slave market, nobody cares. Okay, that's really extremely shocking. And they come with their universal values, but they are unbelievably shocking.
We know that what is happening to Imran Khan in Pakistan. He was removed from power. It was a coup against him because he wanted good relations with the West and with Russia, with China, with everybody. Yeah. But it's something like zero-sum game for the US, for NATO. Yeah. Why they're insisting on these failures? We already had Iraq, Afghanistan. We have the experience in Syria. They're not backing down. They're continuing their policy, this failed policy, now in Pakistan.
Yeah, I feel that this has no rational explanation. Sometimes people say, well, there's economic explanation, but it's not rational, and they're not going to. You see, the rational policy would be indeed a policy of détente with China, and they should have had done that with Russia. Now, of course, it's very difficult, but they don't they need a policy of détente with everybody and accept that they're losing control over the world. If the Africans invest in Africa, if the Chinese invest in Africa and they're more efficient, then let them do it. I mean, we can't control the world. You see, the West is, it's very strange because I'm from a generation who grew up during the Vietnam War, and at that time there was other things, you know, there was Iran, there was all kinds of other things, Guatemala, and I absolutely hated this idea that we are supposed to dominate the world, and we have to. I mean, Europe is itself dominated by the United States, but in the ideology, it's the West, Western values, human rights, and blah blah blah, and we are supposed to intervene everywhere and continue to dominate the world, which we of course did for several centuries. But the decolonization took place, and once it took place, these countries have states, they have armies. They're much stronger than they were during the colonial period. During the colonial period, we were defeated, the French in Indochina, the French in Algeria, the American in Indochina. So what are they expecting? I mean, you see, the fact that they were defeated even by the Taliban, I didn't believe that because the Taliban were so brutal. You know, they were blowing up, there were the suicide attack and so on. I thought they would make themselves unpopular and they couldn't win. But the Americans managed to make themselves even more unpopular. And finally, the Taliban won, which was a surprise to me. I mean, not in the end, but you know, maybe in 2010, I didn't think they would win. But so it seems to me completely irrational, this idea that they will keep on going. But I mean, it's not even, you see, from a purely, of course, certain capitalists earn money with that, like the arms industry and of course the media. They get money from the state to carry their propaganda, Hollywood and so on. I mean, there are all kinds of sectors of society that benefit from these wars, but not the whole society because it costs a lot of money, it increases the debt, and I don't know what Amazon gains from that or Microsoft or, you know, I mean, all these GAFAM industries, which are the last remaining industries in the States, I don't think they gain very much from these wars.
In your opinion, what was the reason of these riots in France?
Well, I think there's a real problem with immigration in the sense that, you know, there is a problem that the French, or at least I think every country in the world, isn't very happy about mass immigration. And there has been what you can call mass immigration, at least in certain neighborhood. Where I am now, I'm in Paris. The neighborhood is very, very, you know, full of migrants. Doesn't bother me. In fact, their work advantages me because I have a fixed income for my pension, and then of course they bring down the wages, so, or the cost of the restaurants, or the cost of food, etc. So from my point of view, of course, it's an advantage, but I guess from the French workers' point of view, or the people who are independent workers, not. And then, of course, there is the eternal conflict about religion, you see. Those who are coming from Africa, at least those coming from Muslim countries, are very religious. And France has been so-called secular, but the secularism has, you know, it's not just that there is no official religion, there is a build-up hostility to religion. I myself have nothing against it, but of course, it makes the relationship between these very religious people who come from countries where religion is almost, you know, unavoidable, and the secular population in France difficult, so that there is what you might call racism. I wouldn't call it racism necessarily, but there is a sort of the sentiment of the French that the French have about themselves, which enters into conflict with this migrant population, I think. And so now there was this incident, I mean, it's not an incident, it's a tragic incident where a young guy was killed by the police. Of course, immediately when that happens, there are two camps. There are people who defend the police because they say, well, the guy was good for nothing, he was running, he drove without a permit, and he had been driving recklessly, and he almost killed people, and so on and so forth. And the police didn't mean to kill him, and it was an accident, and so on. On the other hand, there is other side who say, well, but the killing is obviously racist, and you know, and then that sparked the uprising. But the uprising wouldn't exist if the whole affair had been between French, you see, the police kills a French guy, there would be no uprising anywhere in France. I mean, people might protest the police brutality, right? That's one thing. But the way the protest was totally linked to this rejection of society by part of the Muslim, of the immigrant youth. I mean, I don't like to call them immigrant, but they're French. Their parents were there, the grandparents, great-grandparents maybe came. I mean, they've been around, I mean, not they, but their ancestors, their predecessors have been around for a long time. But they don't feel French, they feel rejected by the French. And so they loot shops, they destroy things, and they destroy public equipment. I mean, the whole protest is without a program, without a leadership. It's what I said about the fact that there is nobody to guide them. So it's completely, I don't like to use the word anarchist because I have more respect for anarchism than that, but it's what people usually mean by anarchist is, it's totally disordered and everything. And it expresses, of course, a rejection of the French society, which is a grave problem, and this rejection expresses itself because of this incident. But you see, it's not the same thing as protesting police brutality. What could have happened if the whole story would have been with France, and there would be, imagine a France without immigration, or France in the 50s or before, where there was very little immigration. People might have, of course, there is a clear case of, of police brutality, and of course they should have. It's normal that people protest that, against that, but that's not what happened. It was much more wide. On the other hand, luckily it didn't last very long. I don't know why, but then of course the government, or not the government, but the judges and so on have been very repressive. People could get 10 months in jail immediately with no if, no but, only for having a bottle of some juice, which had stolen. Of course, you could say they may have stolen more, and why were they there, and so on. But it's quite obvious that the justice system wanted to make an example because those kids, they are maybe finishing high school or something like that. Now they go for jail for 10 months. What are they going to do after that? Maybe their future is ruined, etc. I mean, nobody cares, you see. And that, of course, will also lead some of them to be radicalized. Because after all, if you study the history, including, of course, in Brazil, the radicalization occurs in the jails, and people then become, quote unquote, revolutionaries, meaning that they, then organize themselves, become terrorists, and so on, in a more organized way than these random uprisings. And that may happen. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the people in jail. I don't know how they will react, but that's the danger, I think, of this sort of repressive policy. The comments, of course, by the media were overwhelmingly, contemptuous of those youngsters, and the few people on the left who try to understand the root. I mean, I don't think they understood it correctly, but the root of the anger of these youth were absolutely, like Mélenchon, he was absolutely dismissed. He's outside of the Republican arc, as they call it. They were Republican arc, supposedly, that stops at the extremes of the National Front or National Gathering is not in the, and then the so-called France Insoumise, the party of Mélenchon, is also out. So we have only basically Macron and the Republicans in this supposed arc, and they are the only ones who are legitimate. And I was shocked. I was shocked because I think the whole thing should be, at least people should try to understand, but understanding for them is explaining, excusing, and so on, and they don't want to hear that.
The problem that we're facing in Niger, and we had this coup in Niger, how do you see that?
Well, I think there is, you see, the French have a problem in Niger, which is, I think, basically the same as they have in France, except the Nigerians are outside of France, so it's not so easy to. But of course, it's true. I mean, you see, there was also a tendency on the left to say, oh, let these people come, they will integrate, there'll be no problem, etc. Well, I used to believe that. History has shown that that's not true. I mean, if you take the people in Niger who hate France, or in the region, they hate France. Now you say, okay, come over here. Okay, when I was in Mali, I was at the World Social Forum in Mali. The people from Mali wanted to come to France, but you see that they hate France. They hate France also because they're not allowed to come. But if they're allowed to come, they would not integrate in the sense of feeling French. You see, I don't want to have a very precise notion of integration, but you may feel foreign, like I'm a foreigner here. I've been living in the States. I was feeling a foreigner in the States. I don't think I would have ever, maybe my children would, but not me, would ever felt American, you see. And of course, it's just one individual or a few individuals, doesn't matter. But then if there's a large community living together and they really, I mean, they speak, you know, they use the French word c'est franc, which means français in slang, and it means they speak of the français, although they are themselves French, to mean the whites or whatever you want to call them. So there is a problem, but of course, you see, the way, I mean, I myself, I'm not totally sure that de Gaulle was wrong in his try to cooperation between Africa and France, but this has been resented as neocolonialism, and whether it's exaggerated or not, the sentiment is there. And I think if they intervene in Niger through proxies, namely through the Nigeria and the, ECOWAS, the countries of West Africa, against the desire of the African Union. The African Union say they don't want to intervene. Other countries next to Niger, like Mali, Burkina Faso, and so on, are also against intervention. Algeria is against intervention. So what's going to happen? Is going to be an all-out war there because they want to overthrow this government? I mean, you could say the government is illegitimate, but there have been so many coups all over Africa, and they've been often with the support of the West, that it's the ultimate hypocrisy to just, oh my God, there's a coup in Africa, it's impossible, we have to intervene. And they didn't. There's a coup in Pakistan going on just now. There was a coup in 2014 in Ukraine, that was wonderful. So, I mean, this business of being indignant about a coup is really utmost ridiculous, and of course they should not intervene militarily. What they may try to do, and that's of course equally cruel, is to try to crush the country with economic sanctions. See, the country is very poor, and it depends on other countries for its electricity, and then of course they will cut medication, they will cut food. These countries are not self-sufficient. In fact, my view is that you could leave it, let it go, and in 6 months, Niger is selling gold and uranium again because they have nothing else to do. I mean, it's a bit cynical, but I think it will be much less brutal than having all these sanctions or intervention, etc. And then whether the government stays in power, whether he holds new election, maybe legitimize itself through election, that's none of our business. And I think even the French interests are not threatened, but of course there is this symbolic value of seeing when all these French, especially the French who are fanatically pro-NATO, many of them are, I mean, not everybody, but not the population, but the intellectuals and so on, when they see people in Niger with Russian flags and saying something like that to France, okay, it couldn't make them more furious. So of course these people push, but they don't want, you see, it's also the hypocrisy, because I think the French army and the American army, they work together, they could easily intervene in Niger. But they want weaker countries, like Nigeria, which is probably on the whole militarily weaker than France, to intervene in their behalf. That's going to be a very, very bad impression in Nigeria. This is going to cause trouble in all those countries who intervene, because it'll be obvious that they are like, during the previous war, they were calling tirailleurs sénégalais. I mean, the Senegalese soldiers were incorporated in the French army, okay? And now they are going to say the same thing, except they are working on behalf of France or the United States. And that's going to be very bad. That's going to be very, very bad.